Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah chapter 6, halachot 3. So, as you can see, if you're going through this, day by day, when we go through this, you're going to see that when you walk away from whatever topic that we're on, you should be getting a much deeper, richer understanding of all of the associated topics about it. For instance, yesterday we were talking about Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai agreeing on these issues on Hefker and or on where you're placing something next to a semi-permanent structure. And you should be understanding, like, oh, okay, I get what Bet Hillel's saying, I get what Bet Shammai's saying, I get why they're saying it, and I get I get all the issues of, okay, how do you rectify this? What's the flaws? What's the problems if you don't do it? And that's really what the Yerushalmi is trying to get you to do, is to walk away with some sort of working knowledge. Too many times in Lumda, especially today, people will go and they'll learn and they'll learn and they'll learn and they'll learn a lot of facts and information. But how many people are really walking away with some sort of mastery where they're really mastering a concept? And this way of teaching by the Yerushalmi is a little bit different because it's trying to get you to really get the deeper points of all of the issues that are associated with it, and trying to get you to get some sort of understanding of what's the source for it and why is it this way, and to try to really understand so you get some sort of working knowledge for it. And we're going to be doing that today. We're going to get back to shkichaka, and you're going to get some deeper understanding of how shkichaka works and how it's derived, because in fact it's going to walk you through the Deraita understanding of the sages so that you understand the different laws and implications of shkichaka from how the Torah is written and how the sages are interpreting it. And that's so unique. I mean, it's so rare that you find this sort of walkthrough where it's holding your hand and it's saying, okay, this pasuk in the Torah means this means that, this means this, here's how it works for the law. And you walk away and you say, oh, I see now, I get this. And this is not just made up by the rabbis, this is really in here. I can open this and I can really look at it and understand it. And then after we get this working vision of what the sages are saying and holding our hands and walking us through how they're reading the law out of the scripture, which nobody has the ability to do today, you are left with a puzzle where they're going to walk you through how does it work in real time, in a real field, in a real working environment. And you're gonna start to see it in a much richer way, and you're gonna have a new appreciation and understanding for it. So the Mishnah is gonna, we were talking about this dispute before between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, and we're talking about shkichaka, so it's regarding a sheaf that was forgotten near a wall or a stack of grain. And the Mishnah is now going to be citing 3 instances in which Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel agree that an uncollected sheaf does not become shkichaka. So we're going to talk about it in 2 different ways. Okay, we're going to talk about this Mishnah in one way that's like the simple reading of the Yerushalmi, and that, by the way, is going to be followed with commentary by the Rosh and the Rosh. But the Vilna Gaon and the Rambam, they have different ways to read this, and we're gonna bring that up too. So you're gonna get the simple reading of the Yerushalmi as understood also by the Rosh and the Rosh, and then you're also going to get these other approaches, one by the Rambam, one by the Vilna Gaon. Very important to bring up these other approaches. So here's how the Mishnah goes. It says, regarding the ends of rows, or the uncollected sheaf whose adjacent sheaves demonstrate that it was not necessarily forgotten. So let's just talk about the end of rows. Okay, this is something that we're gonna get into a Doraita explanation where they're gonna walk us through so that we get what this is. What is shchicha really? Okay, and that's why the Mishnah needs to talk to you and me about the ends of rows because it's a definitional thing. Okay, so the Rosh and the Rosh are pointing out that in this Mishnah, it's beginning and it's ends. That's what it's saying when it's saying ends. That's the Rosh and the Rosh saying that. And the Mishnah is referring to a sheaf that's forgotten at the very beginning of a row or at the very end of a row. That's the note by the Rosh and the Rosh. And the Rosh and the Rosh are going to point the following out. They're going to say that the sheaves at the beginning of a row are exempt from shchicha because, as the Gemara will derive through biblical exegesis, in other words, like explaining through how the Doraita law works, the shchicha applies only to grain that's forgotten during the removal process. Remember, we were talking about you have to set a standard and a limit for when something is shchicha, right? So if it's already at the threshing floor and being processed, okay, that's past that definitional time. Okay, so we have this definitional time that shchicha, it only applies during this removal process where you're taking it from where it was being cut to where you're, or it could still be standing too, but let's say the sheaf, right? So to the point where it's going to that central loading pile where you're going to be loading this up onto a wagon and taking it to the threshing floor, this central pile, okay? So, in other words, if it had already been situated in the worker's path, says the Rosh, but was then forgotten by him, then it's going to be shchicha because it was forgotten during the removal process, right? And that's going to be a Doraita thing. If, however, the worker began his removal of sheaves from the middle of the row, the sheaves left at the beginning of the row are not rendered shchicha if they were forgotten, but rather than being forgotten in the course of the removal process, the sheaves were never part of the process to begin with, since the beginning of a row is excluded from shchicha because it was never within the collector's root. So this exemption is going to apply only if the first sheaf in a row, not only to the first sheaf of the row, but also all the sheaves from the start of the row until the point at which the collection process begins. Now, let's talk about the end of the row. And again, I'm still referring to the Rosh here. So the sheaf forgotten at the end of the row is not subject to shchicha because, as the Gemara is going to come, by the way, and later explain this whole Doraita derivation thing, right? In Devarim 24:19, by the way, it says you shall not take the forgotten sheaf, and this is going to indicate the way the sages are going to read this and understand this. Says the Rosh is that it's going to indicate that the sheaf is subject to shchicha only if it is situated in such a way that it can be bypassed during the collection process, so that one must return to retrieve it. The last sheaf in a row, however, can never be bypassed in the collection process. Its being forgotten can result only from the collection process having stopped before reaching that point. Subsequently, collecting that sheaf would not constitute returning to it. So, therefore, it's not shchicha if it's forgotten. Okay? So, the Rosh is going to continue to help us understand it and explain it. And then we're going to get into Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's explanation a little bit. It says that in order for the sheaf to be excluded from shchicha on the basis of being at the end of a row, it must be the last sheaf in a single or final row where there will be no further collection of sheaves. This, by the way, is similar to other cases we had where, let's say that you have rows of furrows where you're having planting, and they put ropes between, and we had this case, you had put ropes between where they're harvesting it so that each furrow constitutes its own field. And then you're going all the way down, and at the end you can leave Peah at the end, and then you can go work on the next quote-unquote field, which is really the next furrow because it's separated by the rope. So what's happening over there is once you've gone over and you've started working on the next furrow, you can't come back and continue cutting because what's left there uncut, that's real Peah. That's already been designated. That's already been allocated. You can't go back and cut. And also, it's the same thing here, right? So once you've worked toward completing a single row, and there's maybe lots and lots of rows of these things, once you've gone to the end of the row, that's going to be the last sheaf of this final row, and there can be no further collection of sheaves because let's say you're moving on to that next row, right? So that would constitute where you've basically forgotten because you're now onto this next row. If you have a case, says the Rosh, where there's another row to be collected after it, the mere fact that the uncollected sheaf is situated at the end of the row does not make it exempt from shchicha, because the removal of sheaves is still in process, and this sheaf is effectively being bypassed for a sheaf in the next row, thus putting it within the purview of the verse, "You shall not return to take it." So the Rosh is asserting that this end of the row exemption applies only to the very last sheaf in the row, which cannot be passed by in the collection process. So if the last two sheaves of the row are forgotten, so what the Rosh is pointing out that even if you went on to the next row to go and collect, and you passed the end of this row, okay, the Rosh would counter my argument, what I just said, and say, no, Adam, this is actually still the collection process. So even though that was at the end of that row, that is not shchicha. It's not forgotten because you're still in this collection process. So I take back my statement and clarify it, and that's why pencils have erasers, because you can make mistakes. So that's my mistake there. That row, that going, even if it's laid out in rows, and you went to the end, and then you went to that next row for the shchicha sheaves, that going to that next row is still counted in the collection process. Now, notice that's a little bit different than the standing shchicha. That's not the law on the standing shchicha. In the standing shchicha, if you went to the next row, that now is forgotten standing grain, and that is standing grain that's shchicha. But here, we have this whole point about collection process, this collection process of the sheaves. So that's the point that the Rosh is pointing out. So if you have the last two sheaves of a row that are forgotten, the second to last sheaf does not become shchicha, although it would not actually be bypassed in this particular instance, since nothing beyond it was collected, and it could be bypassed by collecting the sheaf that was after it. The Biurim of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in Safe 119 says the following. Says that according to the Rosh, that the Mishnah's exemption pertains even to multiple sheaves that were forgotten at the end of a row. That's the comment by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein on the Rosh's very famous commentary on this Mishnah, which appears in his Biurim. So let's talk a little bit about the next part of this statement. It says, so regarding the ends of the rows, we know that ends of the rows is going to be something that's going to be connected to Doraita, and that's going to be something that's very significant because it's a Doraita thing, okay? Or the collection of, or the uncollected sheaf whose adjacent sheaves demonstrate that it was not necessarily forgotten. So this is going to be a little bit complicated. We're going to get into the Rosh again. So this refers to sheaves that are at the end of the first row in a multiple row arrangement. And for example, says the Rosh, you have 100 sheaves were arranged in rows of 10 rows of 10, and it's running from north to south. And if the farmer was following a north-south route, removing the first 9 sheaves of the first row, and then continuing to remove the last sheaf on the row after, he turns back and he begins collecting the sheaves of the next row. So the fact that this uncollected sheaf, when you first started this, this way of collecting sheaves, it lies at the end of the row and it is not exempted from shkika, because it is followed by the sheaves of the subsequent rows. So this is why the Rosh is pointing out that you can be going on to other rows and it still won't count as having been forgotten because it's still in this collection process. So the very fact of going on to that next row doesn't necessarily mean that it's forgotten. This is in the case of a sheaf. That, by the way, is not in the case of standing grain necessarily. We covered that before, and when you're cutting the standing grain, if you've cut out a patch that is too far to be connected by folding it over, and then you went on to this next row, that now is going to be forgotten standing grain and shkika. But the shkika here is going to be the sheaf. So here we have these rows, and if you're collecting it in a sort of pattern, as long as you have a formation of sheaves in the field where there can be an uncollected sheaf that could be construed possibly as having been left to be gathered as a later part of the next row, it's still going to be considered attached and still belong to the owner. It still doesn't get transferred. The next part of the Mishnah, it's going to be a little bit complicated. It says, or the sheaf that one took hold of in order to transfer to the city and placed it on the side and then forgot it. Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai agree that it is not shchicha. We were talking about this yesterday in Halacha 2, chapter 6, Halacha 2, that Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai agree that if you took out a sheaf and you say, okay, I'm going to bring it to the city, and then he put it down and he forgot it, okay, so that now has been, according to both of them, has been past the collection point, right? It's already been collected. He's already had this kavana that he's going to be bringing it to the city. So there's no disagreement on that. What they were disagreeing about is what happens if it's going next to a semi-movable thing that is not cemented in, or it's not permanent enough. Then maybe that becomes forgotten, and that's where the dispute came. The Mishnah is gonna illustrate this exemption regarding the ends of rows, and it says these are the ends of rows. If two workers started collecting sheaves in the middle of the row, this one having turned toward the north and this one having turned toward the south, and they forgot sheaves in front of them and behind them, that which was in front of them is shkika, and that which is behind them is not shkika. So let me just explain that. So if you have a lone row of sheaves, and it's lying at the north-south line that we were just talking about, right? And it was being removed to the threshing floor by a couple of workers. And rather than starting at the ends of the rows like we talked about before, the workers, for whatever reason, decided to start somewhere in the middle and work their way through the row, going from the middle of the row to the end of the row. Okay, that's what this is talking about. Now you have the first row. The first worker started from the middle of the row, and he removed sheaves from there toward the to the northern tip, the northern end. And the second worker, he's going to the south end. He's picking up and going behind. So let's say there's a sheaf that as both of the workers are going away from, there's a sheaf that neither worker picked up, and it seems like it'd be forgotten behind them, right? So one's going north, one worker's going north to collect, one worker's going south. They both start in the middle, and in the middle there's one sheaf that they didn't pick up. This is what the Mishnah is saying. Okay, so the workers, with this sheaf, now the sheaf is to their backs, right? So proceeding along their route and they're collecting the sheaves, the worker, skipped a sheaf, that would also be along the way. Let's say, you now have a couple of sheaves that they turn their back on in this sort of collecting strategy. So, the workers, basically bypass them, and according to the Mishnah, it's stating that the workers forgot the sheaves in front of them and behind them for, where they came, and they came to go into the middle of this row, and they started picking up, and there's a couple of sheaves, and they start working their way from north and south, and there's now behind both of them a sheaf that's missed. That's going to be forgotten. Now, what happens if they could both come to the middle, and you have this one that we know is forgotten, and they're working their way north and south, and there's one in front of them that they missed, and they continue collecting the rest of the row, and now it's going to the back, right? So that will be forgotten. Now, if this one is still in front of them, that's what's interesting about what this Mishnah is saying. If it's still in front of them, and it still didn't get to the back, but they basically ignored this, okay, that is still going to become shkika, says what this Mishnah is saying, okay? So this Mishnah, it would be simpler if it's talking about a single worker who began collecting sheaves from somewhere in the middle of the row. And why does it need to put in two workers? So, the sheaves from the beginning of the row until when the worker would start, would be examples, of an end of a row. And let's say you're working toward the end of the row, and what we were just talking about, it could be looked at as maybe the sheaf is still part of this collection process. But by putting in two workers and they're working their ways to these opposite end of the rows, the Mishnah is putting this in there where they're coming to this middle sheaf, and they're coming to this middle point and start collecting, and it's trying to teach you a different law, and that's going to be, how to consider this end of the row, and that, and where it's outside of, the worker's roots, and it now becomes behind, and now this process is now going to render it a forgotten sheaf. And you couldn't teach this law if the Mishnah only had one worker showing up to do this, because you would say like what the first part of the Mishnah said. So the Mishnah is trying to teach you this law by talking about two workers coming to collect in the middle of the row, and if it were just one worker, you wouldn't be able to demonstrate this law. It would not be a forgotten sheaf. But because it's two working their way to the end of the row, it's going to be forgotten when it goes past them, or even if it's in front of them and they ignored it and continued collecting the other ones, that will still become shkikacha. So I think part of the process, and we're going to get into the Gemara to talk about that, but why it's having to show, two collectors working their way to the end of the row, is trying to teach us that something about this collection process. And that's really what this Mishnah and Gemara is going to be talking about, this collection process. When is this collection process going to be something when there's a flaw or whatever in the collection process, and that becomes forgotten? So the Mishnah now is going to go on to this case of a sheaf whose adjacent sheaves demonstrate that it was not necessarily forgotten. So now it's going to get back to this lone worker, and so we're playing around here in the Mishnah with two workers, one worker, and you need to know it in order to get the right halacha, because the halacha is going to be different. Why? Because the collection process is going to be different. What does it mean to be collected, right? And that's going to be different. And so that same sheaf, if it's one worker, is not necessarily going to have the same halacha or same ownership status if there's two workers and the same thing happened. That's what the Mishnah is trying to teach us. If a lone worker, reads the Mishnah, started collecting sheaves from the beginning of a row and forgot sheaves in front of him and behind him, that which was left uncollected in front of him, in other words, at the end of the row, is not shchicha, but that which was left uncollected behind him in the middle of the row is shchicha, for it is encompassed by the prohibition, do not return to take a forgotten sheaf. In other words, they're saying that this is that mechanism. Let's just take a look at the Rosh to get a quick understanding of what's going on here. So the Mishnah is referring to a case where the sheaves are arranged in these multiple rows, and you have, say, 10 rows of 10 rows, and according to what the Rosh is saying, he's saying that in front of him is being used differently than it was used in the last case with two workers who started collecting in the middle of the row. In this part, says the Rosh, it's used to refer to the sheaves at the end of the row, which have not yet been reached. However, it was used to refer to the sheaves in the middle of the row that were approached and then bypassed. And similarly, the expression behind him is being used here in a different sense than it was in the last case. Here, it is being used to show the middle sheaf that was forgotten and skipped over, and before it was being used to show a beginning sheaf that was behind the workers as a starting point. In other words, the last case of the two workers, they're coming to this middle part of the row, and there's a middle sheaf there, and they start collecting everything but that middle sheaf. And that middle sheaf of that collecting point that's forgotten, that is going to be shchicha. And in this case, it's trying to show that that it's a little bit different here. That it was, here it's being used to show a middle sheaf that was forgotten and then skipped over. And before, they skipped it right away, and here they didn't. So that's going to be a difference in the work process and a difference between one worker and two workers. And the Rosh is going to be talking about that which was left uncollected in front of him at the end of the row is not shchicha. So basically, what that's saying is that the worker left uncollected in front of him, sheaves that the worker left uncollected in front of him are not rendered shchicha, because the sheaves that are next to these forgotten sheaves are going to be adjacent, and that's going to demonstrate that it's not yet forgotten. So that's trying to explain that these adjacent sheaves are going to allow us to save these sheaves that are still in front of him, and it's going to be considered like it's still an unfinished part of this row. And components of unstarted rows, these sheaves cannot be said to have been forgotten. That's the note by the Rosh. So in this, the Rosh is going to point out that the sheaf that the worker left uncollected behind him must be left as shchicha because it was bypassed when he skipped it, and he continued on his route to collect the next sheaf, and retrieving the skipped sheaf would would basically be returning to take it, and it's therefore governed by this prohibition: do not return to take it. So the Mishnah says this is the rule: any sheaf that is encompassed by the prohibition not to return, in other words, it was on the worker's route when it was forgotten. This is going to be shchichucha, says the Mishnah. But any sheaf that was not encompassed by the prohibition, do not return. In other words, it was forgotten outside of the worker's route. The Mishnah says is not shchichucha. Real quick, let's bring in the Tosfot from Baba Metzia 11a, because 11a, by the way, in the Bavli, that's a parallel for it. Tosfot explains that the Mishnah repeats this point in order to allude that a forgotten corner sheaf is shchichucha. And this is, the Derech Hamuna in chapter 5, halacha 69, explains this to mean that a person cleared two adjacent outer rows of a field but forgot the corner sheaf. That sheaf is going to be shchichucha. So let's take a look at the reading from the Vilna Gaon and the Rambam to try to understand it. So we were talking about this explanation of the Mishnah from the Rosh and the Rosh, and they're interpreting the Mishnah with two different exemptions. You have the ends of the rows and the sheaf whose adjacent sheafs that is not forgotten. The Rambam in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim, chapter 5, halacha 10 and 11, are going to be interpreting it a little differently. It's going to be saying that it's going to be referring to a single exemption involving a forgotten sheaf that can be regarded as being part of a row. And to illustrate this exemption, the Mishnah is citing the case of two workers who began collecting from a north-south row in opposite directions, leaving sheaves uncollected in front of them and behind them. In other words, at the end of the row. And the sheaf left behind them is not rendered shchichucha because it is evident that their intention all along was to leave over the middle sheaf of each row and thereby form a separate east-west row across the field. And the sheaf left in front of them is not going to be shchichucha, says the Rambam, for there's no reason to believe that they would take the unusual step of creating a new east-west row in the field's edge. So that's definitely a different reading. The Vilna Gaon in Shenas Eliyahu is going to have a different interpretation of this Mishnah, and he's going to be reading it like this. He's going to be saying, and it's going to be different than the Rambam, he's going to be saying that referring to a single exemption pertaining to a case where a forgotten sheaf can be regarded as part of an adjacent east-west row, unlike the Rambam, he understands that this exemption applies even in the case of a lone worker. In other words, you have the lone worker when he forgets a sheaf at the end of the row. And it's going to come that both the Mishnah's cases are illustrating adjacent sheaves. But in the case of the two workers, where it is unusual for them to leave an uncollected east-west row in the middle of the field, says the Vilna Gaon, the sheaf left behind them is not going to be shchichucha. In the case of a single worker, who would not be expected to create a new east-west row anywhere other than the edge of the field, only a sheaf in front of him at the end of the row is going to be exempt. So let's summarize this, and let's talk about the view of the Rosh, the Rosh, the Vilna Gaon, and the Rambam. Just try to sum it up, and then we'll get close to finishing up. So according to the Rosh and the Rosh, there are three instances where a forgotten sheaf is going to be exempt from shchichucha. The first, number one, is you have the first sheaf in a row, or you have a sheaf that two workers left behind them. Okay, so that's going to be exempt from shchichucha. That's going to be the third case of the Mishnah. The second point by the Rosh and the Rosh is that it is the last sheaf in a single or final row, and that is also going to be exempt from shchichucha. Or you have the last sheaf in the first row in a multiple row arrangement, where the adjacent sheaves allow us to view it as part of a new perpendicular row. So the Rambam, the Vilna Gaon, says that basically there's no automatic exemption for sheaves forgotten at the beginning or end of the row. A forgotten sheaf is exempt from shkika only in the case of two workers who left a sheaf behind them where it is assumed that they intend to form. So that's the key point, where it is assumed that they intend to form a perpendicular row across the field with it and the adjacent sheaves, or in the case where the lone worker left a sheaf at the end of the row, where according to the Rambam, its retrieval would not involve turning back. The Vilna Gaon is saying the exemption in this case as well is due to the forgotten sheaf being viewed together with the adjacent sheaves as a separate perpendicular row. In other words, to the Vilna Gaon's point that this is basically being connected with the row that's next to it. So that's a little bit, there's some different ways to read this. So the Gemara is going to do this magical thing and walk us through the tradition so we can understand what is this talking about, so that when we read the Torah, we can understand this in the right way and really get a rich understanding of it. Gemara is going to try to get the source of the Mishnah's ruling that the law of shkika does not apply to the end of rows. So Gemara reads, from where do we derive that, quote, the ends of rows are exempted from shkika? Rabbi Yonah says, it is written in the passage that discusses the shkika obligation, that by the way is in Devarim 24:19, and it says, when you reap your harvest in your field and you forget. This verse, which deals with the shkika pertaining to standing grain, implies whatever grain you have already begun to reap, you can forget, and it will be rendered shkika, but any grain that you have not begun to reap, in other words, grain that was left unreaped at the beginning of the row, is not rendered shkika if forgotten. So the Rosh Hashanah points out that by introducing the shkika obligation with the clause when you reap your harvest, this verse indicates that overlooked grain becomes shkika only if it was forgotten in the course of being reaped and it was located beyond the point at which the workers began reaping. This is going to exclude grain left unreaped at the beginning of the row, which was never in the path of the reaper to begin with. Very deep point by the Rosh Hashanah. Try to understand this. So Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, until now, we know only that the beginnings of rows of standing grain are exempt from shkika. From where do we know that an exemption for the ends of rows with regards to forgetting of sheaves of cut grain? So the Birkat Cohen says actually we do not yet know why the ends of rows are exempt at all, even with respect to standing grain. But the Gemara is going to be focusing on the ends of rows of sheaves, and it's going to be anticipating the Rabbi Yonah's response. And in Birkat Cohen, it's actually going to be addressing this case specifically, and so you have this like anticipation of what this response is going to be here. And so here's what it is. The Gemara answers, and Rabbi Yonah is going to be answering himself. And here's what the answer is. Rabbi Yonah said, for the verses state, you shall not return to take it, which implies after coming from its place, you shall not return to take it. This excludes a sheaf situated at the end of the row, which cannot be bypassed and returned to. Mara Fulda is going to explain Rabbi Yonah's point and says that the verse is serving as a source for the exemption regarding a sheaf whose adjacent sheaves demonstrate that it was not forgotten. In a case involving the forgotten sheaf or row followed by other rows, where the standard end of row exclusion is not applicable, and where the adjacent sheaves let us view the forgotten sheaf as part of an as yet unstarted perpendicular row, and thus it puts it outside of the worker's route so that his eventual retrieval will not constitute returning to take it. So the Gemara is going to come and ask now another question. The Gemara is going to ask, until now, we know only that the Torah excludes from Shikha the beginning of rows of standing grain and the ends of rows of the sheaves. So where, basically, Gemara is now going to ask, from where do we derive an exemption from the beginning of the row of sheaves and the end of the row of standing grain? That's a good question, because there's both standing grain and sheaves. So what's going on here? Gemara is going to answer it. So by the way, the Mara Fulda is going to point out on this. It's going to say that the first part of the verse, when you reap your harvest, which teaches the exemption pertaining to beginnings of rows, refers to forgetting of standing grain. And the second part of the verse, you shall not return, from which the ends of rows, the exemption is derived, refers to the forgetting of sheaves. The clause, you shall not return to take it, is clearly referring to the forgetting of sheaves, for standing grain simply cannot be taken and must be left to be cut. So let's talk about Rabbi Yonah's answer to Rabbi Yonah's question. Rabbi Yonah said, we derive the exemption from the beginning of the row of sheaves, from the exemption of the beginning of rows of standing grain, and we derive the exemption from the end of rows of standing grain, from the exemption for the end of the row of sheaves. So the Rosh Cirillo is going to point out that the fact that the Torah places the obligation of shkichas kama and shkichas omer in the same verse informs us that the two are analogous to each other. Hence, the beginning of the row exemption that is stated in regard to standing grain applies to sheaves also, and the end of row exemption that is stated in regard to sheaves applies to standing grain as well. But note that from the other halacha that we were looking at, the actual halacha of what's going to be connected to one another for standing grain, for it to be forgotten, and for the sheaves to be forgotten is going to be a little bit different. That's not necessarily going to be analogous. It's interesting that it's not exactly analogous, because one is still connected to the earth and the other has been cut. One is still technically attached and not movable property. The other is movable property. So there is that difference, and that can explain why the halacha would be a little bit different for standing grain that's rendered shkicha. So the next part of the Mishnah we're basically gonna get on to the next part of the Mishnah now, and it's gonna get into something that sort of going to get into something a little bit more depth here. So regarding the uncollected sheaf whose adjacent sheaves demonstrate that it was not necessarily forgotten, everybody agrees it's not shchicha. And the Gemara is going to cite a brisa that elaborates this exemption. Okay, it's going to talk about this exemption. What is the case of the uncollected sheaf whose adjacent sheaves demonstrate that it was not forgotten? If one had 10 rows of 10 sheaves each, and he gathered the sheaf in one of the rows from north to south, and he forgot one of the sheaves, in other words, the last sheaf in the row, it is not shkicha, for it is judged as being part of the row going east to west. So the Rosh points out that the brisa speaks of an instance in which only the final sheaf in the row is forgotten, and the law would be the same even if two or more sheaves were forgotten at the end of the row, as long as they can be reckoned as part of an adjacent row running from east to west. That's the Rosh's explanation of this. The brisa stated that the final sheaf of a north-south row does not become shkicha if left uncollected, since it can be judged as part of an adjacent east-west row. The Gemara inquires, and the Gemara says, if he subsequently gathered the sheaves of the adjacent row from east to west and forgot the same sheaf once again in the end of the row, what is the law with regards to it now being rendered shkicha? In other words, the question is going to come up, does it become shkicha on account of having been forgotten this time when there's no adjacent sheaves to prevent it from becoming shkicha? Or maybe since at the time when it was initially forgotten, it was saved from becoming shkicha, and a subsequent forgetting will not have that effect of rendering shkicha. That's going to be the question. So let's take a look at the Mara Fulda, his explanation. He's saying that after collecting, you have these 10 sheaves arranged in 10 rows. That's what the Bryce is talking about. And after collecting, the first row on the first of the 10, and you're going from a north-south row, and he left the last one in the first row uncollected, and he went back to the southeastern corner of the field, and he began working his way back from an east-west way along the bottom part of the row. And here too he collected only the first 9 sheaves, and he left the last one in the row all the way at the end on an east-west thing. So he's starting off, he's going north to south, he gets to the end, he leaves the end, and then he goes and he picks up the going east and west. Very unusual, but that's going to be a halachic question. So the question is going to be, is this corner sheaf, is that going to be shkicha? Because you've basically cut out a corner sheaf and left it. Is that going to be part of the work? Is that going to be something, even though it's isolated, is that going to be part of the work? Or is that going to be forgotten? So Gemara is going to answer it, and then we're going to conclude for the day. So Gemara answers, says, let us learn the resolution from the following discussion pertaining to shkicha of sheaves. Gemara says, regarding a case where one removed the first, second, and third sheaf of a row of sheaves from the field to the threshing floor, and he then forgot the fourth sheaf and moved on to the fifth sheaf, 2 versions of the law are taught. There are some who teach the Brisa. There are some teachers of Brisas who teach, says the Gemara, if he took the fifth sheaf, the fourth sheaf is rendered shkicha. But if he did not take it, the fourth sheaf is not rendered shkicha. There's another set of Gemaras, and the Gemara reads, and there are other teachers of Brisas who teach, if he passed by the fourth sheaf and merely waited long enough to take the fifth sheaf, the fourth sheaf is immediately rendered shkicha, even though he did not actually take the fifth sheaf. So Gemara says, Rabbi Bon Barhia said, these opinions are not contradictory. The one who said that the fourth sheaf is not considered shkicha, says the Gemara, unless he actually took the fifth sheaf, is referring to a case where there's a sixth sheaf in the row. We talked about this before with the debate between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. And so that was the case, was, hey, is there a sixth sheaf in that row? So just a quick explanation, and let's take a look at the Mara Fulda to help us. So Mara Fulda is basically saying that, in this case, after the first 3 sheaves are taken, there's still 3 sheaves remaining. We talked about this case before, by the way, with this debate between Hillel and Shammai in the last chapter. And it says these remaining sheaves cannot all be rendered shkicha because together they constitute a row of 3. So the fourth sheaf does not become shkicha simply by being bypassed, since it is still considered part of this row of 3 sheaves. Only when the fifth sheaf is taken and the row of 3 is broken, such that the fourth sheaf stands as a lone forgotten sheaf, is it rendered shkicha. In other words, you have this strange thing of coming and collecting it in the middle. You've left this lone sheaf by itself, this fourth sheaf. They took the fifth sheaf and then they moved on to the next row. That fourth sheaf, that's going to be shchicha, says this law in this Gemara. Mara Fulda is pointing out that the law of shchicha applies to one who forgets a single sheaf or two sheaves together, but not one who forgets a row of three sheaves. And if three or more sheaves are forgotten, the landowner may return for them. And it follows that if the farmer would remove the first three sheaves in a row and then forgot to take the next three, they would not be shchicha, says the Mara Fulda, to help us to understand that. The Gemara continues on Rabbi Bun's reconciliation of these baraisas and says, and the one who said that the fourth sheaf is rendered shchicha even if he merely passed it by and waited long enough to take the fifth sheaf, refers to a case where there is no sixth sheaf in the row. So that's talking about a case where there's basically just two sheaves in that row. There's no sixth one there, and if you're overlooking it, and you're even standing there and overlooking it, that's when that's going to take place. That's when the fourth one is overlooked and it stands alone, and you've taken you've taken the fifth one, and there's no sixth one. That one becomes isolated. That fourth one becomes isolated, and that fourth one is now going to be shchicha. So, on the basis of trying to have Rabbi Bun reconcile these two baraisas, the Gemara is going to resolve this inquiry, and the Gemara is going to focus on the case where there is six sheaves. It's not going to be like what we talked about, where there's only sheaf number 4 and 5 in the row. That there is sheaf number 4, 5, and 6. And regarding which the law is that the fourth sheaf is not rendered shchicha until the fifth one is actually taken. So the Gemara reads, now from the time when the farmer forgot the fourth sheaf and passed it by until the time when he actually took the fifth sheaf, was not the forgotten fourth sheaf fit to be judged as part of the row together with the fifth and sixth sheaf, and therefore saved from being considered shchicha? And surely it was. In other words, the fourth sheaf should have been rendered shchicha as soon as the farmer passed by it and waited long enough to go take the fifth one, as is in the case where there are only 5 sheaves. The only reason it does not become shchicha at that point is that it is still considered part of a 3-sheaf row, and it is not shchicha. So in the case of a 2 shchicha row, if you pass the fourth row and you're now standing at the fifth one, even if you didn't bend over to acquire it, the Rambam was pointing out that this now becomes, the fourth one now becomes shchicha, even if you didn't pick it up yet. But if you have a 3-row one, where there's row number 4, 5, and 6, and you passed the fourth one, you went to the fifth one, and you stood there, you didn't actually acquire it yet, that fourth one is not forgotten. It's still part of a row. But picking it up, that's now going to be an issue here once you pick it up, because you've now broken it up and have acquired it, and now you've forgotten it. So that law is going to be different in the case of intention if it's a incomplete row. So the Gemara continues, says, but nevertheless, you say that when the fifth sheaf is removed from the row, that save the fourth sheaf is thereby eliminated. The fourth sheaf is going to be rendered shchicha, says the Gemara. So the actual acquisition of that fifth sheaf now renders it to be shchicha. In the case of a row of only 2, though, once you go to that fifth one and stand by it, because there's no sixth one there to save it, that fourth one becomes shchicha. So evidently the fact that the sheaf was once prevented from becoming shchicha does not preclude it from becoming shchicha in the future. So here too, in the case of our question about this unusual way of harvesting, where you're going from north to south, and then you're going from east to west, and there's one that's left there. In our inquiry, says the Gemara, although the sheaf was originally saved from becoming shicha by virtue of its affiliation with this unstarted adjacent row, it is rendered shchicha when it is subsequently forgotten in the collection of that row. In other words, what the Mara Fuld is pointing out is that once he's going and starting that row and that other row, that east-west row, and collecting that row, that one in the corner that was left, that's going to be the same as when you went and acquired the fifth one in a 3-sheaf row. That's basically what it's saying. And so that's basically what it's saying. So we're going to get into tomorrow more about how the collection process of shchicha works, because that's really what this halacha is all about. Thank you so much.